sound quality. So we'll start at the beginning. The very beginning opening phrase in the Bible, or the Torah as we call it, usually translated, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And one of the things I like about this is that's the standard translation you'll always see, and it's wrong. Because if you look at the Hebrew closely, it says be-reshit, not ba-reshit, and that subtle difference is the difference between in the beginning and in a beginning. And so the difference is potentially significant. And in a beginning, which is more what it is, or just even in beginning, sort of fits the notion that everything we're talking about and what you're getting is sort of one perspective. What you're getting is my perspective. There are other perspectives. The story told is a beginning. There may have been other beginnings. But the essential thing in looking at this phrase, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, or in beginning God created heaven and earth, and that one phrase is subject to so much different kinds of interpretation. The creationists, of course, or fundamentalists would say that means God literally created the world and in a very hands-on kind of fashion, and we're coming up on the year 5777 on the Jewish calendar, and the more fundamentalists would say the world was created 5,777 years ago, and if you ask them about dinosaur bones, they say God made them look old just to fool with us. But you don't have to take it literally. And for me, that was a huge revelation, because, like I presume many of you, my Jewish education stopped with my bar mitzvah when I was 13. And for a long time, I assumed that you had religion over here and science over here, and never the twain shall meet. And if you're going to be a religious person, it somehow meant you had to take your scientific brain out, put it on a shelf, and forget about it, because they're totally at odds with each other. And so it was a great revelation to me 20 some odd years ago when I discovered that no, that's not true, that you can actually believe in science and be a good believing religious Jew, that many of these teachings, such as God created the heaven and the earth, can be understood in a variety of different ways, not necessarily literally as described in the Torah. One of the other important messages about this notion of God creating the heaven and the earth is that God is God for everybody. So there's one God, and it's not there's a God for this people and a God for that people. In the evolution of religion, that's the way it was once upon a time, right? Every god was a local god. Every tribe had their own god. Every grouping, and that was one of the sort of revolutions in Judaism, was saying, no, we're not. It's not just the God of these people. It's the God of everyone who created everything. Whether you believe or not doesn't matter. There's one God, and all of the monotheists really believe in the same God. We just look at that same God through different lenses, but it's really all the same God. And the next line from Deuteronomy, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, hear or listen, O Israel, Adonai, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Adonai Echad, the Lord is one, is an extremely important phrase. So we're very strict monotheists. And the idea, and this is where you get differences between Judaism and Christianity, the idea of God becoming incarnate or something like that is totally alien to Jewish thought on God. And so in most respects, the Jewish view of God is more similar to the Islamic view of God than it is to the Christian view of God. Although even with the Christian view of God, you can also say that the Trinity is not necessarily that wildly different than in Kabbalah. We've got the notion of the Sefirot, of different ways that God has of interacting with the world. But God's unity is a very fundamental principle. There's one God. There's only one God, and the Jewish mystics, the Kabbalists, take the notion of God being one to say that the ultimate level of God is Ein Sof, the infinite, that God is everything, and perhaps a little bit more. Rambam Maimonides describes a little bit more about some of our basic beliefs about God, that it's the most basic of basic principles and support for wisdom to know that there's something that existed before anything else, and that he created everything that there is. Everything in the skies, on the ground, and in between only exists because the fact that God created them. So God is the ultimate source. And one of the things that's interesting about this philosopher, Maimonides, who, as I said, lived in the 12th century, mostly in Spain, is he introduced a lot of Greek thought into mainstream Jewish thinking. And Rambam learned Greek thought, learned Aristotle and Plato in Arabic, because he lived in Spain during the Moorish period when it was under the rule of the Arabs. And the Arabs translated all of the Greek works into Arabic, and Rambam learned it in Arabic. And so when he brought a lot of those concepts into Judaism, things that we now consider absolutely mainstream that everybody believes in, they were somewhat radical in their time. The source from Exodus talks a little bit about the nature of God, and this is a little phrase that we repeat fairly regularly in our prayers: Rachum v'chanun, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, full of chesed, full of loving kindness and truth. And the whole phrase is, and the Lord passed by him, proclaiming, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, they will by no means clear the guilty. And there's an emphasis on God as compassionate. And throughout the course, there are going to be a lot of times, I know some of the people here, I presume, are not from a Jewish background, and so people have, even for those of us who are Jewish, we live in a Christian culture, and so we often know sort of a Christian perspective as well, so I'll do a lot of comparing and contrasting between what we believe and what the majority Christian culture might say. So I've heard a lot of Christians say, their picture of the Jewish God is that he's very judgmental, and everything that we do in terms of an afterlife or something is dependent on having to follow all these rules, and no one can follow all of these rules, so we're all in trouble. But the truth is, ultimately, we similar to other Christians, we rely on God's compassion. The difference is that we do the best that we can to follow the rules, and then once we've done that, we throw ourselves on the mercy of the court, so to speak, and ultimately we're relying on God's compassion. The next source is from the Babylonian Talmud, and I'll say just a quick word of introduction to the Talmud. If you wanted to study one book to understand what Judaism's about, or not really just one book, but a whole series of books, it wouldn't be the Bible, it would be the Talmud. And the reason for that is the Talmud is really the rabbinic explanation for everything that's in the Torah, and it's really how Judaism developed. So the Talmud is in many ways our central source where Judaism, as we practice it today, developed over a period of 600-700 years. So this source is from the Talmud. And it says, to whom did David refer in these 5 verses, beginning with Barchi Nafshi, bless the Lord, my soul? He was alluding to the Holy One, blessed be He, and to the soul. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, fills the whole world, so the soul fills the body. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, sees but is not seen, so the soul sees but is not seen. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, feeds the whole world, so the soul feeds the whole body. Just as the Holy One is pure, so the soul is pure. Just as the Holy One abides in the innermost precincts, so the soul abides in the innermost precincts. Let that which has these 5 qualities come and praise him, God, who has these 5 qualities. And so for me, one of the ways I like to think of God is as the soul of the universe. So just as we have an individual soul, and the difference between a living, breathing person and a corpse is the soul, the animating force. And so I like to think of God as the soul of the universe, that there's the physical world and all of that, and there's a little bit more things that we don't see that sort of equal the part of God. That's like a very brief summary. Happy to entertain any questions or comments before we go on to the next section.
So what you're doing is this is like the different sessions that we're going to go through during the year?
There'll be sessions on some of these topics. It's not strictly organized,
Okay.
like something on each session, but we're gonna talk more about God later.
Sure.
So the Torah and Talmud are 2 different?
Yeah, so they're different things. So the Torah is basically in the Bible. So the difference between the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible is of course, the Jewish Bible is mostly what Christians would call the Old Testament, and the Torah is a subset of that. So the Torah is the 5 books of Moses. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is what we call the Torah. And then the other books of the Old Testament are also part of the Hebrew Bible. Altogether it's called Tanakh, which is an abbreviation for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which is Torah, prophets, and writings. And so all of that, the Torah, the traditional view of Torah says that God gave the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai 3,400 years ago or so. Scholars who take a more scientific approach to it would say that the Torah was put into its current form about 2,400 years ago. And so either way, it's pretty old. And the Talmud is newer. So the Talmud is a rabbinic discussion both of things in the Torah and in other things as well. And the Talmud dates from a period around 100 BCE, before Common Era, to it was closed around the year 600. So it's a compilation, and the Talmud is very, very big. It's 5,722 pages of dense Aramaic.
Would that be comparable to a commentary type thing?
It's more than a commentary. So the tradition says that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, he got 2 Torahs, a written Torah and an oral Torah. And the Talmud is the oral Torah, and in many ways it's held to be almost as authoritative as the written Torah. So it's more than a commentary. And then we have commentary on the Talmud. And later we'll study some Talmud, and we'll look at a page of Talmud and see how it's structured and the things that go into it. But that's sort of the relationship between the texts. Okay, so the nature of man. What I want to do is take just a moment, read this first passage on the nature of man. We're going to do something which is a traditional way of doing Jewish study, which is we take a passage from the Torah and we look at it very closely and ask as many questions as we can to say what is this saying. So go ahead, take a moment, look at this passage from Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27. And just think of all the different questions you might have about this passage.
Translation for the word dominion
Mm-hmm.
Could this be translated as responsibility or guardianship?
More midrashically, the Hebrew word that's used is really like rule over. So it's very, but the way that, I like to interpret it anyway, and many other rabbis do, is to say that it implies responsibility, but that's admittedly a little bit of interpretation. Okay, so you've looked at it. So what questions come up? Let's go piece at a time.
Yeah, us. He says us.
Us.
Yeah.
Who's he talking to?
Exactly.
What's this us?
Talking to the angels, isn't he?
Well, maybe.
Well, to me, the main question is image. How do we know if we can see God?
Right.
How do we know what the image
Right.
of
So
God is?
let us make man in our image. Does that mean that God has two hands and a head and feet? What else? We already talked about dominion.
Male and female.
Yeah. So what's the question related to male and female?
Both are in God's image.
Okay. So that would imply that God is both male and female.
Or that both male and female are somehow
Yeah,
reflective
right.
of whatever we consider to be God.
Mm-hmm.
How about soul? Why do you have to have why can't everybody have the same type of soul?
Okay. So you're saying you're proposing soul as an answer to the question of image.
Correct. And,
Right.
And male and female. You don't need to worry about male or female. You just have soul.
It doesn't distinguish among peoples.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. So, when we say, let us make man in our image, I think this is a very important notion that has caused a lot of problems for people. It does, the generally, I should say almost universally accepted view is this does not mean that God in any way, shape, or form looks like us physically. God is not an old man with a long white beard sitting on a throne in heaven, which for me, I know was a barrier for a long time because I thought that was the Jewish view of God. And so it was a revelation when I, grew up a little bit and learned a little bit. Said, no, that's not actually the Jewish view of God. And so this is one of the things that I find if you talk to people who say they don't believe in God, that's what they often have in mind. They don't believe in God as a supernatural being that looks kind of like us but bigger. And I don't believe in that God either. So that's why I think it's important to develop a more sophisticated notion of God. And what the rabbinic sources mostly say about being in the image of God is that it's free will. That the notion that we have free will is what makes us godlike. That's one of the things that's unique about us, that we have free will, and that's something that they say makes us higher than angels, because angels do not have free will. Angels have to do exactly whatever it is that God wants them to do, but we're unique in creation, and animals also don't have free will. Animals are programmed, and they do whatever it is that they're programmed to do. We're unique in having free will and being able to choose, and so we say that this is the thing that makes us godlike and makes us in the image of God. The next source comes from our prayer book. It's something that we say traditionally every morning, first thing in the morning. Elohai neshama shenatata bi tahora hi. My God, the soul that you've given me is pure. And this is something that's an interesting difference between Judaism and Christianity. So Christianity, of course, has this doctrine of original sin. And we have the opposite. We believe in original purity, as we say in this blessing. So our soul is pure. And this ties into our view of heaven and hell. So some people also think Jews don't believe in heaven and hell. That's not true. We actually do believe in heaven and hell, but our view is a little bit different than the Christian view. We believe our soul starts out pure. As we go through life, we do some not nice things. And so it's as if you had this beautiful, pure, golden ball of a soul, and you're throwing mud and junk and crud and crap all over the top of it to where it gets to that you can't even see that beautiful, pure gold anymore. And what hell is about, or Gehinnom as we call it in Hebrew, is a purification process to restore the pure soul to its original purity. And that process is normally said to take a maximum of a year. And the reason we say Kaddish, the prayer for your parents after they pass away for 11 months, not 12 months, is you're saying, well, surely by the time 11 months have gone by, my parent has been purified. You don't need the whole 12 months. If you think your parent was particularly wicked, you're allowed to say Kaddish for 12 months, but it's considered a little disrespectful.
It's going to be hell either way.
Either way. Either way.
So there really is a hell.
Yeah.
What is that? Because I always hear the definition of hell. There's the devil. And I never.
Our
believed
view
all
of
this.
hell is very different than that. So we'll talk more about
Okay.
that later. But another thing on the nature of man is that it's an important notion from the Talmud and Tractate Brachot. Reb Nachman, son of Rabbi Chizda, said, "What is meant by the text? Then the Lord God formed Vayitzir man." The word Vayitzir is written with two-letter yuds to show that God created two inclinations, one good and one evil. So we all have a good inclination and a Yetzer Hara, an evil inclination. And in the Jewish tradition, the way to deal with the evil inclination is not to get rid of it, but rather to channel it. So we don't have any kind of tradition of celibate monks who are trying to conquer that evil inclination, but rather we channel it in an appropriate direction. For example, the Yetzer Hara, the libido, in the context of marriage is considered a good thing. If you have the drive to be competitive could be considered part of the Yetzer Hara or evil inclination. And we just try and direct that to be competitive, to do the most good deeds or give the most to charity, to take that energy and direct it in a positive way. So one of my favorite examples of this is in the original Star Trek series. There was an episode where Captain Kirk goes through the transporter and there's a malfunction and he gets split into two. The good Kirk and the bad Kirk. And this is absolutely the good inclination and the bad inclination. And at first everybody thinks, oh, this is great. So now we just got the good Kirk and we just got to lock that bad one up or something and everything will be fine. But the good Kirk was completely ineffective. He couldn't get anything done. He couldn't make a decision. He didn't have any motivation. And they realized they had to get both parts back together. And so they figured out a way to rewire the transporter and put him back in and get him to come back out, together with his evil inclination. And that's, I don't know if the script writers who wrote it were familiar with the story from the Talmud about that exact sort of thing. It says in the Talmud one time they captured the evil inclination and they were going to kill it. But they said, before we kill it, let's make sure it'll be okay. So they locked it in a box. And for 3 days, not a single egg was born in the whole country. And they said, oops, maybe we better not kill it or we're going to go out of existence. And so the evil inclination is seen as a necessary thing, but it should be channeled in an appropriate direction. Questions or comments about the nature of man?
When we say the evil inclination is it like a force? That like a life force?
I really think the best description is what in psychological terms they would call the libido. It's that energy, that drive, which is not just about sex. It's all those other types of energy. Yeah.
creativity
Yeah.
together.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll go on to Revelation. So Revelation, how do we know what God wants us to do? Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was one of the great rabbis of the 20th century, taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, said, God spoke. Is it to be taken symbolically? He didn't speak, yet it was as if he spoke. The truth is that what is literally true to us is a metaphor compared with what is metaphysically real to God. And when applied to him, our mightiest words are feeble understatements. So, Heschel says we don't take God spoke literally. We have to understand it on a more metaphorical level.
Yeah, my favorite midrash on that is that when Moses goes up into the mountain to find out what God is really like, God says olive to him.
Right?
And it's silent.
It's a silent letter.
And he can't understand it, and so he says, I'll put it in language that you can understand.
Yep. And so when we look at Revelation, and this is one of the places where we have differences between the different streams in Judaism. So there's Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform are the three major streams. There's also Reconstructionist and Renewal and other things, but we'll focus on the sort of the big three for the moment. So the Orthodox would say that Revelation was what they called Torah Sinai. The Torah came from Mount Sinai, and Moses went up on the top of Mount Sinai. He was there 40 days and 40 nights, and Moses wrote down, and God dictated. God spoke, Moses wrote it down, and everything that's in the Torah is literally the Word of God. And if you ask, well, what about the last few verses where it says, and Moses died, did Moses write those? There's a disagreement in the Talmud. One opinion says, yes, Moses even wrote down, and Moses died because God told him to write it down, but he wrote it with tears in his eyes. And another opinion says it was written by his disciple, Rabbi Yehoshua, who took over after him. The Reform view is at the opposite extreme. The Reform view says the Torah is a book that was written by people, and maybe they were divinely inspired, whatever that means, but it was written by people. And in the conservative world, which is what we are, we have the whole range, in between. My own view, my personal view, which I would say is probably fairly mainstream in the conservative movement, is to say that the Torah represents at the heart of it an encounter between God and capital M man, is represented by Moses on Mount Sinai. But Moses was also a product of his time and place. And so Moses, I think of as a spiritual genius, just as we have different kinds of genius, intellectual intelligence, emotional intelligence, different kinds of intelligence. There's a spiritual intelligence. And Moses was a spiritual genius. But if one of us had the same exact level of revelation from God today as Moses had in his day, it would be a very different book. It would say more about the internet and, a little less about slavery and animal sacrifice, because the revelation is a product also of your time and place. The Christian mystic Thomas Merton had an interesting way to describe the difference. He says, at the heart, there's a religious experience, and the religious experience, the experience of unification with God, is universal. And that experience is the same whether you're Christian or Buddhist or Jewish or whatever you have. This spiritual experience and sense of oneness with the universe is universal. And all the content is basically taking that experience and putting it into different contexts for different people, different times, different places. But at the heart, it's all making sense out of a similar type of religious experience. And so, and then those words were originally oral, and they were written down over time, edited. So I view the Torah as a partnership between God and man. At the heart, there's some of it that comes from God, but it was also worked and handled by the hands of man. But one of the things that I also like about Judaism is we're very flexible on theology, and one of the things that I hope we'll do during our time together is help y'all develop your own personal theology a little bit further from wherever it is, because theology is a very personal thing. Whatever you believe about God is really ultimately between you and God. And so I just hope to give you some more sources and some more things to think about to help develop whatever your own theology and sense of the nature of God is all about.
Rabbi, quick
Yeah.
question. Is it mainstream conservative thought that there really was a Sinai moment, like God gave the Jews the Torah at Mount Sinai?
But again, it depends on what do you mean by God, giving the Torah. So I think I'd say it's mainstream conservative to say yes, there was something at Sinai, but we can also understand that somewhat metaphorically and not necessarily in a direct literal fashion. Whereas the Orthodox would tend to interpret that in a much more literal fashion. And the Reform would be likelier to even question whether it was, anything there or whatever. Right.
Excuse me. Well, regardless, if it says in the Torah that he gave the Torah,
Mhm.
then why would you not believe that if you're a believer?
But see, what I'm saying is we believe that, but we can have different ways to believe it. You can believe it not necessarily in a literal sense. You can believe it in a metaphorical sense, in a more poetic sense, and there are many different ways to believe that, to interpret that, to understand that. And one of the things I appreciate about Judaism is we don't have one particular way that you must believe to be Jewish. We're more focused on what you do than what you believe. And that's one of the reasons why it's very different than, say, the Catholics, who have this book called the Catechism, which is a book this thick that tells you exactly what you're supposed to believe to be a good Catholic. And they, their bishops or whatever had these long arguments hundreds of years ago to say this is the doctrine, this is what you must believe. We don't have anything like that. You're free to believe what you want about a lot of these things, and we're more concerned about what you do. Follow the commandments. Believe what you want about the nature of God or the nature of heaven and hell and things like that. I already mentioned that we had the difference between oral law and the written law. We also have this midrash from Exodus Rabbah. God spoke all these words, saying, with him that stands here with us this day, and also with him that is not here with us this day. So one of my teachers, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, describes what we have as a model of continuous revelation. That revelation was not a one-time thing that happened on Mount Sinai, but it's an ongoing process that continues until today. That and I especially feel when I do work to try and arrive at a decision in Jewish law. So in the Jewish tradition, really a knowledgeable layperson can do anything a rabbi can do, with one exception, and that's make decisions about Jewish law. A knowledgeable layperson can do weddings, can do funerals, can lead services, can do whatever. But technically the difference that being a rabbi makes is then you're considered authorized to make decisions about halakha, about Jewish law. And I feel like when I'm making a decision of halakha, I'm trying to hear what God is saying, and is participating in that process of revelation. And my teacher, Rabbi Dorff, says, well, how do you know if it's revelation or not? If the people accept it, then that means it was a revelation from God, and if they reject it, it probably wasn't. Which is a good lead-in to the next section, which talks about halakha. So halakha, the word comes from the same as the word for walking. So I think of it as the way, the Jewish path, and it really defines a lot of what being Jewish is about. It's our path, our way of sort of connecting with God. And I think of it this way: Buddhists meditate to connect with God. Jews do mitzvot to connect with God. And there are many different commandments and many different ways we put that into place and into practice. But many of the different rules that we have are intended to help increase our God consciousness, to help bring an awareness of God into our daily life. So, for example, we say a blessing before and after eating. By saying a blessing before and after eating, you're taking this mundane act of putting food in your body and bringing a little bit of holiness to it. Taking it as an opportunity to have a momentary awareness of God in the course of your day. And in Exodus 19, it says, if you'll keep my covenant, you'll be my treasure among the people. And it's like this is the deal between us and God. We follow God's rules, and God is our God.
Yeah, a lawyer approached the subject of Sinai. If there was a contract at Sinai,
Mm-hmm.
of those people who happened to be at Sinai, why is it incumbent on us if we weren't there?
Right. But it says we were all there.
Yeah.
So that's the significance of saying we were all standing at Sinai. Let's see, getting how are we doing with time? Let's go to the Ten Commandments. So the Ten Commandments, of course, are very famous. There are two different versions of the Ten Commandments in the Torah, one in the book of Exodus, one in the book of Deuteronomy. They're not exactly the same. There are a few differences. For example, in one place it says to guard the Sabbath day, and the other place it says to remember the Sabbath day, and those are interpreted somewhat differently. But everybody, Christians also say the Ten Commandments are important. So everybody agrees the Ten Commandments are important. How many people here think they could recite all 10 Commandments from memory?
Yeah.
How many do you think you could get to?
Some of them are problematic. For example, no images
Mhm.
has to be interpreted.
Of course. Everything has to be interpreted.
Interpreted by different religions, different ways.
Well, the different religions have different ways of counting the commandments. And not just different. There's the Catholic, the Protestant, and the Jewish way of counting the 10 Commandments are all different. We agree there's 10 in there, but we don't agree what they are. So most people typically get to 6 or 7. So I would suggest a good homework assignment: learn the 10 Commandments. It's a good thing to know. And they split into two parts: 5 that are between man and God, and 5 that are between man and man. Would you say bein adam lamakom and bein adam lachaviro? Between man and makom is the place, the omnipresent or God, and between people. The ones that are between us and God are, of course, the first one in the way the Jews count is, I am the Lord your God. And so there's a debate, is that a commandment? It just says, I'm the Lord your God. It's a statement, not some, and rabbis argue. Some rabbis say, yes, that's a commandment to believe in God. And others say it's not a commandment at all. And in Hebrew, they're not called the 10 Commandments. In Hebrew, they're called the 10 statements, the 10 utterances, because they're not necessarily 10 explicit commandments. So I'm the Lord your God. You'll have no other gods before me, no graven images, don't take my name in vain. The commandment to honor the Sabbath. And interestingly, the commandment to honor your parents is counted among the 5 that are between you and God. Any idea why honoring your parents would be in the side of the list that's between you and God?
Because if you honor your parents, you have a place in the world to come. Isn't that right?
No, the reward for honoring your parents is you'll have length of days.
God gave you your parents. I'm not saying it right. God gave your parents to you.
To you.
So therefore, it's a manifestation.
Right. So that's pretty close to the traditional interpretation, which is to say that there are three partners in the creation of a person: a mother, a father, and God. So your parents are partners with God in creating you, and so honoring your parents is also honoring your creators. It includes honoring God.
I have a question, you probably can't do, what if your parents don't honor you?
You still have the commandment to honor your parents, and it can be difficult if you had an abusive parent, for example. You still have to fulfill that commandment, and the answer is yes, but you're also allowed to protect yourself. And it says honor. It doesn't say obey. It doesn't say love. It says honor. So just by virtue of having brought you into this world, they deserve a certain amount of honor, but there are many ways in which that can be the most difficult commandment of all to fulfill.
Maybe be respectful, but you don't have to.
Yeah, exactly.
If they teach you to be a thief or a murderer, you don't have to obey them.
For sure. If they teach you to do anything that's contrary to the Torah, you don't have to do it. And then we have the commandments that are between people. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness against your neighbor, and do not covet. And the commandment not steal, by the way, here it's talking about kidnapping. It's not talking about pickpocketing. And how do we know that? Because all the other crimes around it are capital offenses, and so it's talking about the kind of stealing that's a capital offense. And the commandment not to steal stuff is found elsewhere in the Torah. It doesn't mean that you're allowed to steal stuff. It's included elsewhere. And rabbis also say that the Ten Commandments are sort of an executive summary, that all of the other commandments can each be mapped into one of the Ten Commandments. So they're like chapter headings. Which brings us to the next subject, which is how many commandments there are. So the Talmud says there were 613 commandments communicated to Moses. So it's not the 10 commandments, it's 613. And another interesting thing about the 613 is there's no agreement on what the 613 are. So there are different lists from different rabbis of what the 613 commandments are. For example, some rabbis include making aliyah or moving to Israel as one of the commandments, and other rabbis don't. So there are some different views of exactly what the list of 613 is. But it's also an interesting observation that no one can do all 613 himself. That it takes a community to do the commandments, because there are some commandments that are incumbent upon men, some commandments are incumbent upon women, there are some commandments for Kohanim, the descendants of the priestly class, some that are incumbent on Levites who serve the priests. Then you have some commandments that are optional, that you don't ever have to do it, but if you happen to do it, you're fulfilling a commandment. Like getting divorced is a commandment. That doesn't mean you have to get divorced sometime in your life.
Can I come and rewind that?
It's a commandment that you should get a divorce rather than be miserable? Is that-
Yeah. You know, and we have other optional commandments. Wearing a tallis is an optional commandment. You don't ever have to put a tallis on, a prayer shawl on, but if you put on a garment that has 4 corners, it has to have the fringes on it. But you don't ever have to put one of those on. So that's an optional commandment. And as I said on Saturday, the tallis, we intentionally put it on when we pray to show that we're going out of our way to fulfill the commandment, whereas nobody goes out of his way to fulfill the commandment to getting divorced.
Are all these commandments, are they in the Bible or just the Torah?
Not all the commandments are in the Bible, in the Torah. Many of them come from the Talmud. So, there's a source from Deuteronomy which is important, which says that if a matter arises that's hard for you in judgment, that you should go to the place that the Lord your God shall choose, and you'll come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge who shall be in those days, and inquire, and they shall declare to you the sentence of judgment. So the judge who shall be in those days is an important concept. That it's what's allowed Judaism to stay a living religion. That it's not all the answers are in a book and you just turn to the book. That we have to adapt our laws and customs to the world around us, and that's what we have rabbis for. That we try and find the balance between our traditions on the one hand and the world that we live in on the other hand. And so when these questions arise, you go to the judge who shall be in those days, and they may make a new ruling, like in the conservative movement. Some I forget what it is now, probably going on 10 years ago. It was a big deal when we decided it's okay to ordain gays and lesbians as rabbis, or to officiate at same-sex commitment ceremonies. That was an evolution in law, and the authority to do that comes from this verse, that you go to the judge that shall be in those days, and we adapt, we adjust.
Rabbi,
Mhm.
what's the tension then I mean, I can understand that in the conservative movement, but then in the Orthodox movement, is that it's just less?
Yeah, so the Orthodox also change, right? So it's a misconception to think Orthodox Judaism never changes. It changes. It just changes slower.
My wife was involved in one of those debates. In 1972, they developed an amniocentesis, a test for Tay-Sachs disease.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't correspond to the Orthodox 3 rationales for terminating a pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to debate as to whether that constituted grounds for termination of pregnancy.
Yep.
And that was in 1971, so that's...
Sure. So that's a good example, So Orthodox rabbis have to go through the same process. One of the biggest differences between the Orthodox approach to halakha and the conservative approach is there are two big principles in making decisions on Jewish law that sometimes conflict with each other. One says that you should follow the most recent decision from the past and that you shouldn't overrule it unless your rabbis are greater in wisdom and number than the previous rabbis who made a decision. And there's also principles that says the judge has to go by what he sees in front of his eyes. And sometimes those two principles conflict, and the Orthodox tend to give more weight to following the previous rulings, and in the conservative movement we're much more willing to say no, we have to adapt, we have to adjust based on what we see in front of us. But we use a very, very similar process in making those decisions.
Question.
Yep.
Do you have like a Jewish court that you go to, or is it just locally?
So that's a very good question. There's no central court. In principle, every rabbi is the decision maker for his or her community. In the conservative movement, we have an organization called the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which has 25 rabbis and 5 lay observers, and they meet 3 or 4 times a year. And the way these laws evolve is an individual rabbi or maybe a couple of rabbis working together will write what they call a tshuva, which means response. So everything is based on a question, and then you write a response to that question. And then this Committee on Law and Standards will review these responses, and then they'll vote on whether they want to consider it sort of a official position of the conservative movement or not. So one of my hobbies, so to speak, is halakha. I'm very interested in halakha because for me it's the intersection of what we believe with what we do. So I've had 4 of these teshuvot approved by the law committee. Most rabbis never have one that they ever submit. I've done 4, and I'll probably do more in the future on all sorts of different subjects. 2 on issues of business ethics, 1 on saying Friday night prayers early during the summer months, and 1 on whether a convert can use a name other than son or daughter of Abraham and Sarah. Those were all approved by the law committee. And so we're also a pluralistic movement, so you don't need a majority of the law committee voting for your opinion. If you get 6 out of the 25, it's considered a valid opinion and other rabbis can rely on it. The only significance of the law committee putting their seal of approval on it is it gets published in the book of halakha that the conservative movement develops. It gets published on their website. It gets published to other rabbis. But even if they vote unanimously against it, an individual rabbi can still choose to follow it. He doesn't. It's not binding on a rabbi.
What I like is, very much like the Supreme Court, is that you publish the minority opinions, because somewhere down the road they may turn out to be the right.
Exactly. That someone may want to rely on the minority opinion for his or her circumstance. I mean, for example, it's well known that in the conservative movement there's an opinion that says it's okay to drive to the synagogue on Shabbat. Less well known is that there's also an opinion that says it's forbidden to drive to the synagogue on Shabbat. Rabbis can choose which is the one they think is right for their community. And it varies. In Jerusalem, nobody follows the opinion that it's okay to drive to shul on Shabbat, because everybody lives walking distance to a synagogue. So that's one of the reasons why you have rabbis instead of just a book, so that you make these decisions based on your community, your situation, and not just a universal one-size-fits-all.
So can converts have other names besides Abraham and Sarah?
Yes. So that was my ruling, which interestingly it was very controversial. Got a lot of votes against it, even though nobody disagreed that technically I was correct, that there's no legal barrier to a convert using a name other than son or daughter of Abraham and Sarah. It's just custom. But sometimes custom is stronger than than law, and it's a long-standing custom, which is a good introduction to the next topic I wanted to touch on.
Does the Reform movement and the Orthodox movement have the same kind of system, where they publish?
The Reform movement does. The Reform movement publishes Teshuvot, which is very interesting, because if you think about it, the Reform movement their theology is such that they're not bound by halakha, but they still publish a lot of these sort of halachic opinions. They don't do it the same way that the conservative and Orthodox do. So the conservative and Orthodox both follow a pretty rigid system for making those decisions, and the Reform don't follow that system so much, but they still write responsa literature. The Orthodox don't do it, they're much more sort of fractured into different groups. What you have in the Orthodox world is more common that an individual rabbi will publish a volume of his legal opinions.
In Jerusalem, is there not a Sanhedrin?
No Sanhedrin. It hasn't been for almost 2,000 years. There is a group trying to bring back a Sanhedrin, but very few people really think they have any authority to do that.
Napoleon tried.
Right. Yeah, it's been tried a few times. Caro tried to bring it back in the 16th century, but
isn't there a bet?
no. There's a chief rabbi of Israel, but it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, like
For what?
For divorce.
To get a get.
Okay, so actually to get a get, well there are many beit din. Every time we do a conversion here, there's a beit din. Right, so a beit din just means a rabbinic court, but it doesn't. There's no single rabbinic court that's got more authority than any other rabbinic court. Right, so I form a rabbinic court here with 2 other rabbis, and we got just as much authority as any other rabbinic court in the world.
Just another question. In Israel, there are Reform and conservative movements?
Yeah.
And churches and...
Yeah. synagogues.
Not American.
They're not. Well, we're starting to get some support from the government. And one of the things I'm going to talk about, if you come to services this Shabbat, I'm going to be talking about religious pluralism and the fact that there's no freedom of religion for Jews in Israel. So I just want to touch for a moment on the subject of becoming a Jew. The Shulchan Aruch, which is a law code that was written in the 16th century, says the courts informs the person interested in converting of the fundamentals of the faith, that is the unity of God and the prohibition of idolatry. They go into this at length. They inform him of a few of the simple commandments and a few of the weighty commandments, inform him of some of the punishment for transgressing the commandments, but they don't overdo it. They don't get into all the details. If he accepts, they circumcise him immediately, and afterwards he's immersed in the ritual bath in the mikveh with 3 attending him, and since he's immersed, he's like any other Jew. So if you go by the Shulchan Aruch, the whole process should take an afternoon. And typically, it's more like what we have with this course, where you go through not necessarily a full year, but close to a year, so that you can go through the holiday cycle and be exposed to the different holidays and traditions that are along the way. And if any of you who are here are interested in conversion, you should contact me separately at some time. We can discuss that a little bit more. But the last point's an important point. Since he's immersed, he's like any other Jew. So there's there are some people who get this notion, oh, you can't convert to be Jewish. Your mother has to be Jewish. That's not at all true. So we do welcome converts. The difference, one of the big differences between Judaism and Christianity is our attitude towards conversion. So, and this is the reason why there are 2 billion Christians in the world and 14 million Jews. So the Christians believe if they convert you, they're doing you the world's biggest favor. They're saving your soul, because they believe in original sin, that you can't be saved unless you're baptized and that sort of thing. Whereas Jews believe the opposite. We believe anybody can get into heaven. You don't have to be Jewish to get to heaven. All you got to do is be basically an ethical monotheist. Believe in God and be a good person. That's all you got to do to get into heaven. So we don't have a theological imperative to try and go out and save people by converting them. And in fact, we believe if we convert you, we're making it harder for you to get into heaven. Because if you're not Jewish, you only got to follow 7 rules, what are called the 7 Noahide laws. 7 things that God had told to Noah. And as I said, those are basically be an ethical monotheist. Don't steal, don't do bad things like that, and believe in God. And that's enough. You become Jewish, now you got 613 rules to follow. So we're raising the bar. On the other hand, I find those rules as part of our path for connecting with God, and I find it meaningful and powerful, and I love it and all that sort of stuff. But it doesn't have the same sense that we're saving your soul. We might be enriching your life, and it's worthwhile, and it's a good thing, but doesn't have that same sort of imperative that the Christians are trying to save your soul, because we believe you can still get to heaven even without becoming Jewish. And we do have some people who end up sort of becoming what I would call more like camp followers, who like Judaism, they believe in a lot of what we believe, but they decide they're just going to stop like with the Noahide thing, and that's more often with guys who haven't been circumcised. I had one of those, and he kind of he met with his urologist, who talked him out of the notion of getting circumcised. If you've already been circumcising your man, it's a very easy process. We just draw a ritual drop of blood, which I do myself. But okay, so then we have, let's see, we got the different commandments that are between man and God. So these are some of the things that ritually set Jews aside from other peoples, like observing the Sabbath. On the 7th day, God ended his work, which he had made. And note that it says, on the 7th day, God ended his work. He didn't end his work on the 6th day. He ended on the 7th day. He created something on the 7th day. He created the Sabbath. Because the Sabbath is more than an absence of something. It's a positive thing in and of itself. And so observing the Sabbath is a very big thing in the in the Jewish world. The next source from Exodus talks about feasts, the holidays. So we have holidays are also a big thing for us. One of the things I like about the Jewish calendar cycle is that the holidays sort of take you through the whole range of human emotion. We have happy holidays, we have sad holidays. It goes through a very wide range. And we have proof that the Irish are one of the lost tribes because both Jews and the Irish have a springtime drinking holiday. The sources from Leviticus are the rules about keeping kosher. So it's well known that Jews don't eat pork, and that comes from this verse in the Bible in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 2, that any animals that we eat have to have both a part the hoof and chew the cud. And so the pig does have does part the hoof, but it doesn't chew its cud, so it's not kosher. Camels chew their cud, but they don't have a split hoof, so camels aren't kosher. Anything that lives in the water has to have fins and scales, so shellfish is not kosher. Catfish and shark are not kosher. And with birds, they don't have such a simple identifying thing. The Torah brings a long list of the birds that are kosher and the birds that aren't kosher, which created a problem when turkeys came along. Because turkey is a New World animal. So the rabbis in Israel and in Europe never seen a turkey. So after America was discovered and they had turkeys, the first response of rabbis was to say, it's not in the list, it's not kosher. And the people voted and overruled the rabbis, basically. People said, Rabbi, this thing's like a chicken, we're going to eat it. And they did. And the rabbis eventually said, okay, fine, it's kosher. And then we have the commandments that are between man and man. Where famous line in Genesis chapter 4 where Cain slays Abel, his brother, and he asks, am I my brother's keeper? And in the Jewish tradition, the answer to that question is yes. As a matter of fact, Cain, you are your brother's keeper. Taking care of others is a big part of our religion. The next source in the Talmud talks about saving lives. So one of the highest principles in Judaism is saving lives. So you can overrule any of the other commandments in order to save a life. So if someone has a life-threatening illness, you drive them to the hospital on the Sabbath. And that's not a violation of the Sabbath. It's following the rule to save lives. The source in Exodus is one that I like because it highlights the way Judaism evolves. So very famous in the Bible, it says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. So a lot of people who aren't familiar with the Talmud read that and say, oh, Judaism's this really harsh, religion. If someone, pokes out your eye, you're going to poke their eye out. Ew. The rabbis in the Talmud say, no, that's not what that verse means. You might think that's what it means, but that's not what it means at all. Rabbis in the Talmud say, an eye for an eye means if you poke out someone's eye, you owe him an eye's worth of compensation. So and this is really the origin for American tort law, that you have to provide compensation for medical expenses, for time lost from work, for pain and suffering, that's equal to an eye. And the rabbis insist that interpretation is the plain meaning of the verse. They say anybody who says that the plain meaning of the verse is to poke out someone's eye, you're distorting the Torah. That it's about monetary compensation. We're commanded to give charity. So if you see a poor person asking for money and you turn your eye away and don't give him charity, you transgress a negative commandment. And this is one that's difficult for a lot of people because this means that, what you see one of these guys downtown with his hand out, you're supposed to give him something. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable with that. And I know I grew up in New York, and in New York you were taught, don't look at those people, keep your eyes straight ahead, walk fast. But it says that this is not what we're supposed to do. And you're not supposed to be judgmental about, well, what if he's going to use it for drugs or alcohol? That's not your issue to be the judge.
You just give them food, Rabbi.
That's even better. So you can certainly give him food instead, or give him something else. But what you're not allowed to do is to turn a blind eye. And even a poor man who's subject of charity himself has to give. So everybody has to give something, has to share something. And the source from the Talmud in Gittin, towards the bottom of the page, we support the poor of the Gentiles along with the poor of Israel, and visit the sick of the Gentiles along with the sick of Israel, and bury the poor of the Gentiles along with the dead of Israel, for these are mipnei darchei shalom. These are the ways of peace. So we treat non-Jews the same way as we treat Jews on these matters. The source at the bottom of page 6 from Exodus is a very important source that we'll talk about a lot more later. You shall not wrong a stranger nor oppress him, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. So, having gone through this experience in Egypt of being slaves, we know what it's like to be a slave, and if you've been abused, there are two different possible responses. Sometimes someone who's been abused will become an abuser himself, and sometimes the other alternative is to become compassionate. And so what we're taught is be compassionate. Don't go in that direction of becoming an abuser yourself because you were abused. And that's why we have this reminder 36 times in the Torah, be kind to the stranger, for you are strangers. You know what it's like. And so that's a very important and central concept.
Isn't that the most repeated,
Yeah.
not wrong as strangers, the most repeated?
Right, 36 times in the Torah. It's repeated a lot. The next sources talk about the temple, and I just want to say one brief thing about the temple, which also relates to our relationship with the land of Israel. So, some people I've talked to Christians who have a hard time understanding why Jews are so obsessed with Israel. It's just a place. And it goes back 2,000 years. It goes back to when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, which in the year 70, Jerusalem was destroyed. The Romans destroyed the temple. And something I didn't appreciate until I talked about it with a friend of mine who's an Episcopalian priest is that it was just as big a deal for the Christians as it was for the Jews. Because the early Christians did everything that the Jews did. They brought sacrifices to the temple, same as the Jews did. The only difference was they believed that Jesus was the Messiah. So when the temple was destroyed, they couldn't bring sacrifices anymore either. So everybody had to adapt. And this is where Judaism and Christianity went in very different directions, which reflects the difference in the nature of our relationship with Israel. So the Christians basically said, well, the physical place is not that important. That God is everywhere, so the notion of a heavenly Jerusalem developed. And this, I think, was heavily influenced by the way the Greek thought came into Christianity through Paul, where they have a very big separation between body and soul, and the soul is what's important, the body's nothing. In Judaism, we don't have that kind of split so much. We see more an integration between the body and soul. And the rabbis went in a very different direction. The rabbis said, no, we're never going to forget the temple. We're never going to forget Jerusalem. And they built in a lot of reminders of the temple and of Jerusalem into our liturgy, into our prayers, and into our rituals. So our Friday night Sabbath dinner table is turned into basically a stand-in for the temple. Our table is the altar, and we have all of these symbols that connect it to the temple. 3 times a day, an observant Jew prays that we should go back to Israel. And so it's been ingrained in us, this connection, for thousands of years, which is what made it such a big deal for us to be able to go back to Israel and in this century, especially after the State of Israel was formed in 1948. But that was a huge difference and a very important issue. It's getting late, so I'm not going to talk a lot about the afterlife and reward and punishment, other than to say, as I mentioned earlier, that we do have a concept of heaven and hell in Judaism, although it's not necessarily one view or one way, and it's more viewed, as I said, this process of purification that, generally speaking, takes a maximum of a year. We have a lot of teachings on the Messiah, which of course is another one of the places where there's a big difference between Judaism and Christianity. We definitely believe in the Messiah. The difference is Jews don't believe the Messiah has not come yet, so we're still waiting. And what we believe in as the coming of the Messiah is what most Christians would call the second coming. But from our point of view, we take one look at the world around us, and the predictions for the days of the Messiah is it's supposed to be an era of peace and harmony, and everything's supposed to be great, as in Isaiah 65. I will rejoice in Jerusalem, joy in my people. There will be no more an infant who lives days, or an old man who hasn't filled his years, etc., etc. The lion shall lie down with the lamb. And as Woody Allen said, the lamb won't get much sleep. But it's supposed to be an era that's perfected. And we look at the world around us, it's still a very broken place. And so we feel we're not there yet. There's also an opinion in the Talmud, though, which says, and one of the most interesting classes I had in rabbinical school was on Messianism. I had a semester-long class on Jewish views of the Messiah, which was absolutely fascinating. We'll have a class session devoted to that subject. And there are views that are 180 degrees out of sync with each other. So there are some that interpret that passage in Isaiah literally, that say lions are going to become vegetarians, and there are others that say it's strictly a metaphor. And one opinion in the Talmud says there's no difference between this world and the days of the Messiah, except there'll be no bondage of foreign powers. Israel will not be under foreign nations. As it says, the poor shall never cease out of the land. And if you go by that opinion, I would suggest David Ben-Gurion was the Messiah. But most people don't hold that way. But it's a very interesting subject, and I think the concept of the Messiah is a useful concept. And my views of the Messiah are on the handout. You can read it later at your leisure. I'll close with on the last page, and why I called this session Judaism While Standing on One Foot. So there's a story told in the Talmud of a non-Jew who came before the Rabbi Shammai and said, I'll convert if you can teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot. Right? In other words, do it pretty quickly, Rabbi. And Shammai pushed him aside with a ruler. Said, get out of here. You're not serious. Go away. Whereas Hillel said, what's hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That's the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go study. And so this has been my attempt to share Judaism while standing on one foot. And for me, the best summary of what Judaism's about is this last verse from the prophet Micah, that God, he has told you, O man, what is good, what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And so now that we've done our learning, we can do a little bit of the administrative stuff. If you want to take one of those and pass it around. So we'll be meeting, what you're getting now is sort of the syllabus. It's got what all the classes are, what days we're meeting. We have a website for the course, which some of you have signed up. If you haven't signed up, I encourage you to go to that website and sign up. You can get the material in electronic format. It has links for the video if you have some time when you're either out of town or your car broke down or whatever, and you want to participate via video. I'm trying to record the sessions, and we'll have links to the recordings as well. And we also have the ability, if people are interested, there's an online forum where you can post questions and comments and can have some discussion with me, with each other. That's all available there if everybody wants to use that. And so this is the list of what the classes are. Next week we're going to talk about the holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which are coming up. Then we'll have a couple of weeks without classes because of those holidays. Then we'll talk about some more holidays that we're having. This is our holiday season. So the Hebrew month of Tishrei, we've got like half of the holidays on the Jewish calendar are in that 1 month. It's a little bit of an intense time period for us. After going through that, starting in November, we'll have a series where we talk about what Jews believe, so Jewish views of God, evil, revelation, all of these different things. We'll go into more detail. Then we'll have a unit on Jewish prayer. We'll have a section on the commandments. We'll have some history, and we'll have life cycle events. And basically, it'll run through May. Anyone, if there's anyone here who's interested in conversion, if you go through these classes, that fulfills all the educational requirements for conversion. Yeah, that's. Oh, and so there's also some reading, if you are interested in conversion, the book list, the bibliography is kind of more mandatory, and for the rest of you, it's clearly optional. There are a couple of books, and the annotation describes which ones you need right away, which ones you get later. There are 2 books to get right away. One by Harold Kushner called To Life, which is a good overview, and one by Joseph Telushkin called Jewish Literacy, which is a really good reference. It's kind of dry, but it really does have everything you need to know to be sort of a literate Jew, and that was really his intention in writing that. And then there are some other books that we'll use as references when we get to the particular subjects, like To Pray as a Jew by Chaim Halevi Donin, a book on the rites of passage, a book on how to run a traditional Jewish household, which talks about the Sabbath and keeping kosher and things like that, a book on the holidays, and then a sort of a basic primer to start in on learning a little bit of Hebrew. You don't have to learn Hebrew necessarily, but it's good to learn some Hebrew because we do use it a lot. And then there are certain books that are sort of should be a part of any sort of Jew's home library. A Siddur, a prayer book, a Chumash, which is the Torah, and a Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible. That's it for now. Any questions, comments?
I have a question. Can you drink the camel's milk?
No. But here's an interesting thing. Bees' honey is kosher, whereas you can't eat a bee.
Then why can't you drink the camel's milk?
They make an exception for the bee because they say that it's not really a product of the bee itself in the way that milk is, but it's taking the nectar out of the plants. So it's viewed as just sort of the transfer mechanism as opposed to something that's created by it.
Well, I heard nobody would want to drink a camel's milk unless you grew up on it because it tastes terrible.
I would believe that.
But you can eat an egg that's not from a kosher chicken.
No, you can't eat an egg that's from a non-kosher bird. You can't eat an eagle's egg.
Yeah, but the chicken isn't kosher till you slaughter
Any
it
chicken,
that way.
no, any living chicken, it doesn't matter. It's alive. You don't eat eggs from dead chickens.
That was okay. My swarm kills wearing off.
That's okay. So you'll want to pay attention when we have that class on kosher.
But there are some egg cartons that have hechsher on them.
Yeah, but nowadays it's not really needed. But we'll talk about that some more later.
What are the requirements for conversion in addition to the educational requirements?
So when you complete the educational requirement, you go before a Beit Din, which is a rabbinic court of either 3 rabbis, or it could be a rabbi and some knowledgeable lay people. They'll ask you some questions that are basically more concerned with your sincerity. It's not like, which month comes after Adar in the Hebrew calendar. If you don't know that, you flunk. And then if you're a man, you have to either be circumcised or have a ritual drop of blood drawn, if you're already circumcised, and an immersion in a mikveh. And we have a mikveh in our basement. A mikveh is a ritual bath that's fed by living waters. So it collects rainwater and channels it down into our ritual bath, and that's it.
And if for a woman?
Woman, the requirements are the same, except there's no circumcision, obviously.
I never really had a good understanding
Sure.
of the concept of heaven and hell. I really thought there was no hell. I was vaguely familiar with Gehenna, but I thought that was sort of like a limbo state. Is that